Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Aubrey Strike-Krug. I direct the Land Institute's Ecosphere Studies work, and we're so excited to have you join us for the second day of our 2020 digital gathering as we enjoy and experiment with this new format. So as with the sessions yesterday, we'll begin this morning with a brief, about 4-minute contemplative video that I'm going to introduce momentarily. In this video, you'll get to experience and reconnect or connect with the land and a place on our campus. And the sounds are just on site, so no narration. So don't worry about missing anything in that. And then once the video is finished, our session facilitator will introduce himself and get us started. So for this morning's video, we'll start with the word threshold, which comes from the word thresh, to separate the grain from the stalks and chaff. Here in this video, we're going to come and witness the work of threshing in the Land Institute's agricultural research as we move through the research building into the threshing building. Interns and staff are threshing the recent harvest of sainfoin, a perennial legume, to prepare for the next cycle of selection and breeding. We see the skilled human labor, tools and machines, and infrastructure that are helping to make possible a long-term change. Metaphorically, that change requires urgent movement across the threshold into new perennial grain agricultures. So here's the video. Wonderful. And now I'll turn it over to Bob Jensen, who will facilitate this session.
Good morning, everybody. I'm just looking around to see if all is well. If you can hear me, wave. Okay. The screen that I'm seeing doesn't tell me exactly what's going on, so I'm going to assume that you all can hear me and I should keep talking. My name is Bob Jensen. I'm speaking to you from Arroyo Seco, New Mexico, just outside of Taos. I have escaped the state of Texas, hopefully never to return. And I'm glad to be here with everybody. I wanted to first of all say thanks to all the people who've been doing the work to put this together and make the technology work. Will, Megan, Aubrey, Carl. It's been pretty smooth and I think we're all grateful for that. My task is to introduce our speakers first of all, but before doing that, I wanted to start off with a song title to frame what we're talking about today. It's from one of my favorite singer-songwriters, John Gorka, and the song is called "The Old Future's Gone." That is the future that we imagined when I was growing up, which was a future of endless bounty. We now recognize is no longer possible to imagine. So Gorka sings, "The old future's gone. We can't get to there from here." And I think a lot of the work we're doing is reckoning with that. This session is about what the long view, taking seriously a deep human history, can teach us about how to reckon with that future, which is certainly going to test our capacities in new ways. So we're going to start hearing from Wes Jackson, as most of you know. Land Institute President Emeritus Wes Jackson co-founded the Land Institute in '76 after a career that included stints as a farm and a ranch hand, a journeyman welder, high school biology teacher, football and track coach, environmental studies professor before coming to the land. His degrees are in biology, botany, and genetics. The last one was a PhD from the University of North Carolina. His forthcoming book from the University Press of Kansas, which should be out in March of 2021, is titled "Hogs Are Up: Stories of the Land with Digressions." Now, in Wes's presentation, he will not explain the meaning of that title. You're going to have to buy the book to find out. Also wanted to point out another book forthcoming from the University Press of Kansas titled "The Restless and Relentless Mind of Wes Jackson, Searching for Sustainability," will also be out in March. That was written by some guy, not important. So Wes, please start us off.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Bob. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm reminded of the radio back when I was in back in the 40s. Good morning, everyone, to all of you out there in radio land. The Scott Puffer Motor Company, 10th and Quincy, brings you the latest news. Well, the Scott Puffer Motor Company is long gone. Radio is still around, but here we are with something else. So I'm to talk about what does the long view of agriculture teach us now. Now I'm going to be telling you some things that many of you already know, and partly because I've said them thousands of times over, but so what? We'll read Psalms many times over and don't mind doing it. But the first thing is we are a species out of context. We've been around with the big brain 200,000 years. We started agriculture 10 to 12,000 years ago. And that was the beginning of the journey of being a species out of context. So that's number one. Number two is we are in an apocalypse. Now, don't get freaked by that. If you bother to look it up, it's not so much like what you would find in the book of Revelation. What it is a kind of an unfolding of things, um, not not perceptibly known, perhaps, but they're things that could not be known apart from a kind of an unveiling. So to be in an apocalypse, you are in the midst of a kind of an unveiling. And so we've thought about putting up a sign, "Welcome to the Center of Apocalyptic Studies." Well, because people may not bother to look up the Greek and Latin understanding of that, we dare not do it. We did put a conference on in Matfield Green on toward an ignorance-based worldview, Bill Vitek and I, and just put a little banner across the street, "Welcome ignoramuses." What we're dealing with is a problem of knowing our reality. And we are of the opinion here that we got to have a downpowering in order to be able to negotiate this apocalyptic moment. So having been in this apocalypse for those 10,000 years, we've not known it. We've not known it until rather recently. So apocalypse is forever. And we're never going to get it right because the selection pressure on us for 200,000 years and then becoming rather instantly in geologic time, we know that while we'll never get it right, we do know that we can do better. And so that's the first reality associated with being a species out of context. Now, the question is, what is the long view teaching us now? We've been on that journey. And one of the things we've learned is that soil is as much of a non-renewable resource as oil. Now, that's hard for a lot of folk to get clear because they'll say, "Oh, Wes, you ought to see my garden. I've really improved that garden. I've improved that soil." Or, "I wish I could show you this soybean field that I got and what it was when I first bought the place." So the idea is that we can improve soil. Well, we improve, say, that soybean field, but much of that is the consequence of what I call an acceptable theft. It takes a long time to make soil, and the message, I call it the message of the terraces in Mendocino County, California, where the Pacific plate sliding under the continental plate about every 100,000 years. And so there are 5 of these terraces, one 500,000 years old, another 400, 300, 200. And what you find, even though with the vegetative structure, nature's vegetative structure there, that the nutrients are being pulled down with time. And so someone says, "Well, why are there not?" Well, at the 5th terrace, we have what's called a pygmy forest. And you look at the nutrients in the soil there and you see that it's a pygmy compared to, say, the redwoods back in terrace 2. And there's an intermediate terrace in terrace 3. What you see is that the nutrients are not there to support the biomass. So the big question becomes, why are there not pygmy forests, pygmy prairies, pygmy whatever all over the world? Well, because we have geologic activity. And what we know is that if you don't have volcanoes, if you don't have tectonic plate movement, then, well, a friend of mine says Australia is going to be poor because its last geologic activity was 65 million years ago. It's poor and it's going to stay poor until there's that geologic activity. So that puts it in the category of soil as much of a non-renewable resource as oil. So the next consideration is that, what else does the long view teach us? It's taught us that soil is much of a non-renewable resource as oil. The long view also teaches us that early life, the journey from minerals to cells, is carbon-based. And we've gone after that carbon unwittingly, getting at the young pulverized coal of the soil. That was the beginning of agriculture that began the drawdown of the capital stock of the soil. We've had the forest carbon, which sponsored the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Soil carbon gave us the kind of agriculture we have. We've had the coal, and also we've had whale oil. And then, of course, there is Drake's oil well in Western Pennsylvania, 1859, the same year that Darwin's Origin of Species comes out. So there's oil, natural gas. So how do we deal with the imperative of carbon? We're going to go after it. Bacteria on a petri dish with sugar is just going to divide till they hit the edge of the petri dish. And then if they had a consciousness like ours, they may say something like, yeah, well, there's some of us are getting to the edge of the petri dish faster. And so we put in social justice. And so we can all hit the edge of the petri dish at the same time. Now, I'm calling it an imperative. And I don't think we need to get into the big question today, which is one of the oldest unresolvable problems about the difference between free will and determinism. But it's not exactly like a spirochete going to the light, but we just go where that highly dense carbon is. So if we were conscious bacteria, we might be able to do something about it. But I mean, if we were bacteria and conscious, we probably would do no better than what we're doing now. So how do we deal with the problem of, I'll call it determinism for the moment? And that is one of the big things that we're wrestling with here at the land. So one idea is, and Stan Cox is his book, we got to put a cap, probably have rationing, and then we may be able to deal with the problem. Now, it sounds pretty bleak so far. We've adopted certain assumptions in this journey as a species out of context. We've had an enlightenment, and at the core of the enlightenment is the Royal Society, that its logo in Latin, it's in Latin, but translated says, trust no one, trust no one. Find out, get verifiable knowledge. Now, it's important to hold that in there, because for 2,000 years, we have had the story out of the New Testament. Jesus has died on the cross. 3 or 4 days later, he is seen, and Thomas, who's a great doubter, Thomas, he doesn't believe it. He wants verification. And finally, he has verification. He feels inside the wound of Jesus. And Jesus says, when he announces, it says, "I believe." And Jesus says, "You have seen and believe. Blessed are they who have not seen and believe." Now, that is, I think, a sheer force at work in our world. And it works like a kind of a pair of scissors in a way. A pair of scissors can press inward, or it can divide and produce outward. We've got this conflict within us to believe without seeing. And also, I want to see the data. I want to see the evidence. And so, but this is just part of what I think is not being addressed enough within the so-called movement as we wrestle with the problem of climate change. So as a species out of context, knowing that we will never get it right, what does the long view really teach us? And for us at the land, those of us that know us, we're using nature as the standard or the measure. For agriculture, we recommend it for forestry, fisheries, and a kind of a culture for dealing with the problem. So I got part of this from the language of Amory Lovins many years ago. We're really on a journey toward an elegant frugality. And we start by recognizing that we're land animals primarily, that food, clothing, and shelter before the fossil fuel epoch came primarily from the land. We also, I think, for this moment, need an awareness of the real economy. And that to me gets back to land, being land animals. And it also means the development of the cultural capacity as land animals, learning the skills of the management of the land. And of course, I've already said we look to nature's standard or measure. And so when we think about educating the young, we have to think about the food, clothing, shelter, especially we're going to be using less fossil carbon. And that means becoming more connected to the land. Well, we have some engagement going with Kansas Westland right now on the Mentor project. Mentor is a little town 5 miles south of Kansas Westland and 4 miles from some of our research sites, less than that, 2 miles. And President Matt Thompson is working with us. But what we're thinking about is how is it that you can teach the young to become connected. So we'll leave that for further discussion. So can this be done? You know, the idea of a kind of a return within our county here, I think we have something like 16, 17 small towns that there's only 4 of those that has a post office now, but they've been mostly abandoned. I think we're going to need a new Homestead Act in a way to get more people back on the land and at work with us. So can this be done? Well, all I know is that we've made a lot of progress on this perennial grain polyculture. And I like to think about a great moment. It was a week-long moment back in May in 2019 at the University of Lund. Leonard Olson, and who is a professor there, and Tim Cruz, and Leonard is a member of our board. They organized a gathering. There were 92 people from 6 different continents: ecologists, agriculturists, soils people, geneticists. Now, it was, I think, a very auspicious gathering, and I think will go down in the history of science. It had to do with the marriage of ecology and agriculture. Now, I just want to back up a bit. I've been talking about the development of a different way of thinking about who we are on the planet rather than making our journey dependent upon the drawdown of the extractive economy in the social, political, economic realms, and to show the kind of progress that has happened in less than a half a century. It was so heartening at that meeting at the University of Lund to see the enthusiasm about the marriage of ecology and agriculture and the coming together of two different emphases. The agriculturists have had the burden to be prescriptive. Ecologists have had sort of the slack to be descriptive. In those two cultures, there was already some coming together, but I think it came together in a very different way. So it's important to realize that during this journey, as a species out of context, we recognize that there are a lot of things that will need not be lost as we downpower. And I think of the late George Wald, the Nobel laureate biologist at Harvard, and I've repeated this probably 100 times over the years, but Wald said it very well, that we living things are the late outgrowth of the metabolism of our galaxy. That is something the ancients did not know. The carbon, which enters so importantly in our bodies, was cooked in the remote past of a dying star. We have not always known that. The ancient seas set the pattern of ions in our blood. We didn't know that. The ancient atmospheres molded our metabolism. And so here we are, products of a dying star, a journey. So the price for knowing something like that and other things has come at the loss of the ecological capital. So if we can hang on to that, and I think we can, I think maybe to just finish it off this way, this may not be the best metaphor. We might say we came up on an elevator and it was too fast. And now we can take the steps down. And as we take the steps down, we can be examining what is prudent to take with us and reject what we should not take with us. The Industrial Revolution has given us insights that we would probably never have had. But the Industrial Revolution has been a great destroyer of species, ecosystems. It's now a major factor in heating up the planet. And so I think these are some exciting times ahead, but we are all, to use the title of Bob Jensen's book, we are all in apocalypse now. And that is not a bad thing. There is an unveiling, and well, some of us will see where it goes. I think that's it for now.
Okay. Thanks, Wes. You know, you took us on a trip there. We talk about human history in thousands of years. You talk about geologic history in millions of years and the history of life in literally billions of years. So a lot to cover there. You remind us of the tensions. There are, huge differences within the human family, yet we are one species with that carbon imperative. The tension between the quest to know through evidence and the role of faith in human history. And then bringing it all back to Mentor, just a few miles from where you're sitting right now, and the project of trying to repopulate the countryside. So thanks for all of that. We're going to move on to our next speaker, Caitlin Taylor. And I'm going to take a little more time to introduce Caitlin than I did for Wes. That's partly because many of you on this session won't know her work. And it's also partly because she's, frankly, a little more interesting than Wes is. So Caitlin directs the Food System Design Lab at the MASS Design Group based in Boston. MASS is a team of more than 120 architects and other professionals, as well as artists. And they practice design that is purposeful, healing, and hopeful. Caitlin's MASS projects include the Poughkeepsie Public Market. And if you're listening, Will, I think somebody is going to have to mute Wes, please. The Poughkeepsie Public Market and the Good Shepherd Conservancy right down the road in Lindsborg, Kansas. She's designed and built projects on a lot of different scales, from civic flood control in Las Vegas to an agricultural campus in Rwanda. Caitlin has an undergraduate degree in biochemistry and molecular biology from Wesleyan University. She's got a master's in architecture from Yale. She's taught at the Yale School of Architecture and the Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, and also particularly relevant for those in the Land Institute family. Caitlin also owns and runs a vegetable, fruit, and flower farm in rural central Connecticut with her husband and 2 business partners, which they own in a cooperative structure. So next we'll hear from Caitlin. Caitlin, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, everybody, for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so I can share some images. Can everybody see that? Thumbs up? All right. So first, let me just say what an insane honor it is to be here together with all of you today in dialogue with this inspiring group of people. As a longtime fan of the work that you all do at the Land Institute, and as a lifetime reader of yours, Wes, this is my very first Ecosphere Studies gathering. My hope is that it's the first of many, and that when we do this again next year, we'll all be together in the big barn with the warm summer wind blowing through the walls. And before I start, I'll just say, Wes, when I have taught architecture and design studios in various graduate schools scattered around the Northeast, my sections have always been a bit of a curiosity, because where other classes were building big, intimidating models out of epoxy and resin, my students were growing carrots in glass aquariums and threshing whatever random grass they could find on the side of the road and scribbling in the margins of your books. I'm fairly certain that your timeless writing and thinking hasn't been assigned to architecture students at Yale before or since, but I've always had and always will beg of them to think just like plant breeders with a long view of time, because it is my deeply held belief that the world has to and will experience meaningful transformation when, among many, many other things, those responsible for shaping the built world unlearn absolutely everything that they've been taught from the canon, and instead design for our perennial future. So I'm going to spend just a couple minutes contextualizing my work, which exists in the entangled intersection of our built environment and our food system, before we embark on a conversation together about infrastructure and the land, and how exactly we can give the former context on the latter, to use your word. Thanks to Bob's introduction, you all know by now that I'm both a farmer and an architect, and I come to my practice of both with belief in their fundamental practical theology, to borrow Ellen Davis's amazing term. I approach my work with curiosity about how both farming and architecture require multiple simultaneous views of time. They both require holding in our heads the immediate, steady, ongoing need for nourishment and shelter, alongside the urgent need of acting now in service to long-term systemic transformation. So my work is, or tries to be, balanced in the overlap between those two views of time, and is in search of mysterious and unexpected periodicity. So from a meal to our bodies, to our buildings, to our infrastructure, to our ecosphere. As I get started, I'll just quickly say, I hope you'll forgive my use of images. We architects and artists are visual thinkers, of course, but I also find images to be really useful tools when we talk about this stuff, because I want to remind us what our built infrastructure actually looks like, what our buildings and infrastructure are made of, how big they are, and how much space they take up. I think it's important to have visual reference for those things. So why are buildings and infrastructure important might be a question that we ask in this crowd. And I would answer by saying that buildings and infrastructure are material and spatial manifestations of our values. They provide a human scale environment in which we can live, a threshold between us and the larger world, to return to the concept of threshold. They provide us with material safety and a place to land. And our built infrastructure is designed to answer, or should be designed to answer, or in some cases is actively designed to not answer questions like, where am I? Why am I here? Why are we here? What materials are here that we can share with the earth? What do we value? What does it cost? What does that actually look like? And to your idea of context, Wes, they can give us context. I'll talk a little bit about how I approach my work at Mass in a minute, but first I want to just very briefly and more explicitly link the dueling, accelerating, converging crises at the heart of our production of food and our production of the built environment, which are both fundamental to our global planetary crisis, the apocalypse, as Wes told us, and are intimately interwoven in a technocratic, even spread logistics web of infrastructure throughout our ecosphere. I don't need to tell anyone here, of course, that our industrialized food system is built so far outside the natural laws of bioregional economies or ecologies that it is, by definition, a machine fueled by vast injustice. But you may not know that the building and construction industry is actually every bit as extractive and fueled by the same drive towards impossible homogeneity, control, efficiency, and profit. And to build on something that Aubrey said yesterday, food systems and building systems are co-emerging and are entangled and are both tangible material manifestations of our thought systems. So in much the same way as descriptions of healthy food, putting in air quotes, in the grocery store so often belie the vast untold degradation of land, people, animals, and ecosphere that was necessary to supply it, sustainable, also in air quotes, is a similarly hollow descriptor of anything even remotely just, regenerative, resilient, or even actually literally sustainable about our built environment. Like this project, the new Apple headquarters in California, which is touted as being the greenest building on the planet, but exists at the end of a long and brittle supply chain that prioritizes performance over provenance. So contemporary sustainable building practices are defined by adherence to rigorous environmental performance metrics, but with a super narrow understanding of the impact of striving for perfection. Architects as a profession are trained to design and build so-called perfect machines, but at what cost? The supply chain that has grown up around the sustainable building industry is incredibly opaque and diffuse, like the industrial food system, and has so rapidly come to life in the same decades. Buildings and infrastructure have become placeless embodiments of these opaque global supply chains rather than testaments to the ecological, social, cultural, and economic landscapes in which they are situated. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about the various definitions of globalism in our discussion, because I think it's a really critical word to reclaim the meaning of. But in the meantime, I just want to say that industrial scale infrastructure is invisible by design. It's not an accident that it blends into the even spread logistics of our national infrastructural web and in no way reflects the places in which it is embedded. It is the same everywhere and therefore belongs nowhere. And yet there is another way, of course. Buildings are vessels for our collective memories and the containers for our shared beliefs. And I believe that in this way, buildings have the power to shape culture and culture change. In this example, which is one of my favorite buildings by a beloved Finnish architect who some of you may know, called Alvar Aalto, he collected, for his house, he collected 50 different types of bricks, manufactured and fired within driving distance of his house, and watched them weather over time, documenting how each responded to the weather and the climate. To me, this building is like plant breeding for architecture. It's the lowest tech way of finding what works with a methodology that absolutely cannot be rushed, and by definition can only exist in this time and in this place. I love this project because I believe it's an architecture of constraints and it's an architecture of limits. So of course, I'm preaching to the most informed choir on earth here when I say that we can't possibly separate the material choices that we make about our built world from the life-giving ecosystems in which we exist. Not only is it impossible to draw lines between the hard stuff and the soft stuff, but it's our vain and pointless attempts to do that, our striving for efficiency at all costs, that's responsible for our current high energy infrastructure. To borrow one of your concepts, Wes, it requires such high energy resource flows just to keep our material infrastructure in such a direct and ongoing war with entropy. And thankfully, the material life of our built environment is finally being called into question industry-wide, thanks in small part to a disruptive and insurgent group of troublemakers at Mass, of which I'm proud to be a part. Whereas the architecture and construction industries have traditionally been sold falsehoods about the absolute importance of operational carbon, the energy required to run buildings over time, and how to use technology to use less energy. We're now understanding more and more about the energy required to extract, source, process, and transport building materials, which we call the embodied carbon of our built world. And thank goodness our deep dive into this has started to ground, literally and figuratively ground buildings and infrastructure in place. As we've heard so much great discussion of yesterday, we're now understanding with more and more clarity that bringing our human life on Earth back within reasonable limits cannot be solved with technocratic solutions, but will require place-based, regional, diverse, and perennial structures. And to do so will require creativity and imagination. So I'm going to briefly describe how we treat this as a design provocation by giving 3 quick examples of projects of ours, and I'm happy to share more about any one of them during our discussion. I'll go quick. This project, the Butaro District Hospital that you see here in this image, has done many things. For one thing, it's transformed this remote region in northern Rwanda to a model of excellent preferential treatment for the poor, built in partnership with Paul Farmer's Partners in Health. But the reason I include it here today is not for that reason, but because it's an example of how waste material, this volcanic stone that is abundantly available and considered a nuisance by the farmers in Rwanda, has been transformed into a regional resource and has developed an entirely new labor economy around it that values craft and handprint and geology over concrete import. Ilima, in the jungles of Congo, was built as a school using the shortest possible supply chain that you can imagine, the strictest possible limits. 84% of all the materials and money on this project were spent within 100 kilometers of the building site and moved to the building site on motorcycles and by barge, literally defined and limited by the capacity of individual people. And RICA, the Rwandan Institute for Conservation Agriculture, shown here, is a 1,200 hectare campus that tests these limits at a massive scale. 56 buildings are currently under construction on this campus, and they're comprised of 96% materials that are sourced from the tiny little landlocked country of Rwanda. And of the hundreds of people on site, the hundreds of craft people and hundreds of builders, 98% of them are Rwandan. So on this project, we've developed the first environmental product declaration in Central Africa by painstakingly tracing every material from extraction to use in order to benchmark the entire campus at 2/5 of the embodied carbon per square foot of the international average. So as part of an emerging conversation in the building trades about embodied carbon, I have to ask on every project, people get tired of me for asking so much, what else is embodied in the decisions that we make about our built infrastructure? How do we give our deeply held values, material logic, and spatial form? How do we root our infrastructure in time and place and recalibrate the space that our stuff takes up? how do we do that at the scale of the table, the scale of a person, the scale of a building? How can form follow function at the scale of an ecosystem or an economy? I'm gonna stop talking now, but as we're all out here in the world in search of answers, or as Wendell Berry says, as our hope sets out in desperate search for reasons, I believe that we're all designing for uncertainty and change every day. And this challenge requires that we develop a new definition of infrastructure alongside our new definitions of value and wealth and nourishment that we've been talking about the last couple days. I would like to shift away from a definition of infrastructure as a totalizing or deterministic tool for organizing the world, or as a way of maximizing efficiency of global logistics, and towards a definition of infrastructure as a minimum scaffolding that secures the roots of regional economies and regional communities. To me, that new infrastructure will be perennial and durable and resilient. It will be indeterminate, and it will be accepting of limits. So I'm in search of the smallest and most deeply rooted infrastructure that we can design and build, infrastructure that is literally native to its place. And in this moment of profound cultural and structural reckoning, I'm in search of lessons from the ecosphere about how we welcome change and how we repurpose and retool the infrastructure that we've got for new and some very old purposes with elegant frugality, which is a term that I love that Wes just shared with us. In my work, we're seeding some very small catalysts that will, we hope, long after I'm gone, we're gone, show us tangibly how our global supply chains can reorganize themselves when we grow every building, like you all grow perennial grains, in open dialogue with the soil and non-human life, as part of a regenerative culture that values justice over profit, and with a long view of time. So maybe we can talk more about radical hope in our discussion, but maybe I'll just end my portion of the talk by saying that to me, eating and building are both radically hopeful acts. They both represent a belief in the future that transcends our ability to understand what it is or what it looks like. But because of the radically hopeful and wild imagination that's required to nourish ourselves and our places, I believe that we can tell new stories together, that we can design and draw what it actually looks like when those stories come to life. And then of course we have to actually build it, which is going to take all of us.
Thank you, Caitlin. I just have to comment on that last slide. That is from a poem of Wendell's, as you know, called How to Be a Poet. And I found a reason to read that poem out loud in every class I ever taught. And those lines I just want to emphasize. There are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. Has haunted me from the first time I read it. And I'm glad to see others feel the same way. I just wanted to say it was really exciting. This was your first engagement with Ecosphere Studies, but the connections are so obvious. Wes used to say a sustainable agriculture on its own is no good without a sustainable culture. And you're talking about how that has to come to be in building, how sustainability isn't just a buzzword, it has to be real, embodied energy, looking at supply chains, all that stuff is incredibly exciting. So thanks so much for joining us and bringing that. My job now is to remind everybody that there is a Q&A function on Zoom, and in a while we will be taking your questions to Wes and Caitlin. Before we do that though, we're gonna invite our respondent for this session, Rachel Strohr. You heard yesterday that Rachel has done many jobs at the Land Institute over the years and now is moving into her new role as acting president. I should probably apologize to Rachel. I said I was in New Mexico, having successfully escaped the state of Texas, to which Rachel just moved last year. I didn't mean to rub it in, Rachel, that you're stuck in Texas and I got out. So apologies for that. But Rachel will offer some thoughts before we move into the Q&A. Rachel?
Very good. Thank you, Bob and Wes. And I'm stumbling around getting over my mind being completely blown by Caitlin's presentation. Having spent the first part of my career at an architecture firm that was focused on sustainability, and seeing your work of taking this to a whole new level and how related it is to the questions and issues that we grapple with at the Land Institute is still blowing my mind. So I'll try to breathe and let that sink in, but thank you so much. Wes didn't blow my mind so much only because I've heard him say these things before, and so they've had more time to settle. Thank you for that. I feel like there's sort of three words that I took from Wes's presentation that I definitely believe are sort of maybe some key things that we continue to grapple with. Soil, carbon, and enlightenment. And if we can figure out as a society how to think differently about all of those three things, then we might have a chance at being here for the long term. So thank you for focusing us on those things, Wes, and giving us the sort of depth of the depth of understanding of why we should be thinking about those things. I also just want to highlight the last bits of Wes's presentation about the Lund meeting and the importance that represents to the Land Institute and to the work broadly on perennial grain agriculture and this marriage of ecology and agriculture and society or humanity really as well. I just second that observation. And I think we're committed, and in the coming months we'll be grappling with how to really act on that moment in a way that is meaningful for the long term and intensifies and actualizes what happened at that conference into the world over the coming years, with more global engagement and the formalization of that community of people who were involved in that conference. So another thing that comes to mind just with the topic of the long view now, and I think this is a more surface level comment really, when I think of the long view now and when I think of Wes's comments about this idea of what do we carry with us, this community, almost everyone on this call probably, and those who have been involved in ecosphere studies over the last 5 years, and those who have been involved with the Land Institute for a longer history, know this. But the thing that I notice when I leave my desk and my Land Institute world and I go to the bus stop with my children is that people are rushing around for the wrong things, and how to help those who aren't embedded in this community and thinking deeply in the way that we are to start rushing around. You know, there's an urgency right now. We're faced with an urgent challenge with climate change. You know, we have data that tells us we have a decade, not hundreds of decades to act. And so juxtapositioning the long view with now and the urgency of now. So we're rushing around for the wrong things. So how do we start rushing around for the right things and leave behind the things that are holding us back from the kind of cultural awakening that I think we need. So thank you for that reminder, Wes, of what do we carry forward. And I grapple with how do we get others to see that without spending, and maybe the way that they do it is to come to the Ecosphere Studies Conference. And the more people we get here will be a good thing, and certainly the more college classrooms who are where this sort of thing is taught is beneficial. And there are many ways to let this idea begin to seep into the culture. So I'll leave it at that. Just some reflections on what I heard, and leave plenty of time for Q&A, because I've already seen a number of great questions, and you all are smarter than I am and will ask better questions. So have at it.
Thanks, Rachel. I will be monitoring the Q&A from that you were all submitting, and as probably was the case yesterday, there are going to be more questions than I can deliver directly, so I'll try to synthesize and put things together where possible. One place I thought we might start, a very simple question about the notion of a sort of technocratic elite. So the technocratic elite of the modern world is generally in service to power and wealth. So that's a problem of socialization. Yet the skills of the technocratic elite, you know, like architects and soil scientists and others, is essential to deal with the pressing problems. So maybe to start off for both Wes and Caitlin, you both have been trained in very traditional sort of ways. And in some sense, we're both socialized to join that technocratic elite. How do you derail that, that process and both help people develop the skills necessary to deal with the apocalyptic situation, yet not simply serve power? Either Wes or Caitlin maybe want to start with that.
Well, I'm counting Caitlin as company, and you always let company go first.
Thanks, Wes. I think that the question reminds me of an amazing statement by an activist named Tony Bambera, I think is how you say her last name. And I'm going to use the word artist really broadly, but she says that the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. And I think that, you know, we can ask ourselves how we are working, again, talking about artists very broadly. I would be interested to hear maybe from you, Wes, how you consider yourself an artist. Of course, I consider myself an artist of the built environment, but, you know, we are either working as artists in service to capitalism, in which case our job is to maintain the status quo. We heard some really good conversation yesterday about like what we have to ask ourselves, what is being sustained. We are working, in that case, we're working within the economic mechanisms and the feedback loops of capitalism. I'm happy to talk a little bit. I don't want to get in the weeds of like Mass's business model as a firm, but, you know, we have structured our firm as a nonprofit in order to deliberately act and practice outside of market forces. But, you know, if you're an artist or an architect building things, or a writer writing in service of oppressed people and degraded non-human populations, then your job is to make the revolution irresistible, to show us what we're heading towards. So, you know, in my personal practice as an architect, I believe that architecture, you know, gives us a material vocabulary for describing the revolution, but also can call, you know, can bring a certain form of imagination to the cultural and spiritual crises that we have ahead of us. And, you know, I guess I'll just leave it there, that I think that, you know, we have a responsibility as artists to describe in irresistible terms the revolution that we have ahead of us. And I think that the fact of the matter is that's going to involve designing a built infrastructure that is built within biophysical and equitable limits, not technocratic solutions.
Well, I see the problem of a return to the land as getting back a cultural capacity that has been lost. It isn't just soil that has been lost, but it's the loss of a lot of the cultural handing down that was um, necessary for living in a world that was far more sun powered than what the world is today. There's, I think, an Amishman, Wendell told me this story, Wendell Berry told me this story. We can get the horses back, but how do we get the people? And so the development of cultural capacity, I think, is a major factor. That's one thing we're thinking about with the Mentor Project. I thought of Leland, my friend Leland, who for 29 years got by on $500 a year or less and was buried in his backyard with, it didn't cost the family a penny. And Leland said, I do this because it's easy. Well, how did he get to the point of it being easy so that he could live in a shack 6 by 16 feet and on 1 acre? He did that as a result of a kind of an understanding that began with Thoreau. I can't get there. I don't think I'd get there if I was 10 years old. But there are the Hubbards that live on the bank of the Ohio River. Musicians, fluent in a couple of languages. They lived off the river, and they had their garden and their goats. There are a lot of different ways to go, but it has to begin, I think, with people developing a cultural capacity. And that opposable thumb had a lot to do with the making of the brain. And we need to get the thumb and the brain working more together now. I think that when we are using our hands in some kind of a construction, we also gain insights that have to do with the intellectual. So the life of the mind, I think, is going to be necessary, and the mind that counts it important to understand Aristotle and Plato and what they were about, and why and what happened with the Enlightenment. But at the same time, developing know-how. Thinking of Caitlin, those buildings that were built from just a few 100 yards away. That is culture. That's some kind of a capacity. And so that to me is the journey for life within the better understanding of the apocalypse. Knowing we will never get it all right, but we can do better. We're not going to become gatherers and hunters again willfully, at least very soon. So the down power begins. Well, I'll stop there for the moment.
Okay. There are a lot of questions, quite detailed, that are going to be hard to throw out. So again, I'm trying to bring things together. One of the things that's coming up in the questions is a recognition that we don't start from a pristine world. We're trying to, as that poem of Wendell's indicated, deal with a desecrated world. We have now large cities with many tens of millions of people. How does one pursue the kind of architecture, Caitlin, that you're talking about, locally sourced and all of that, in Beijing or Tokyo? Those kind of questions are very real. In the agricultural side, we're dealing with degraded soils and landscapes. So maybe both of you, and Caitlin, you can start. Talk about the real challenges dealing with the world we live in, not the world we wish we had to work with.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and you know, I think that the place to start is that my daily reminder to myself as an architect is that the most environmentally, ecologically, culturally responsible thing I can do as an architect is not design and build new buildings. So how, you know, so that then the question becomes, how do we transform the super high energy infrastructure that we've got into something lower and more resilient and more changeable. And I think that, you know, the question of Tokyo with 30 million people in it, or New York with however many million people New York has, is one that unfortunately there isn't a good answer to, but we don't, but, you know, I would say that, like, we don't have a choice, right? If this COVID moment, this global pandemic moment has taught us anything, it's taught us lots of things, but one of the things it's taught us is that the brittle supply chains on which those cities depend are breaking. And that's proving what we here in this conversation and others like it have been yelling at the top of our lungs about for a long time, that the whole thing, the whole industrial logistical web is rotten at its foundation. It can't bear its own weight under any stress. You know, and of course, like, meanwhile, we're asked to do something really simple, wear a mask in order to protect other people, and that's become this issue. So, you know, of course, I'm not like the first to say this, but we have to ask what the pressures of this moment reveal to us about how we're going to respond to some of these longer, bigger questions, how we respond to climate change in places like Tokyo, for example. You know, and to speak just very well, I'll say that Lisa yesterday did such an amazing job articulating that we need new stories about new markets and new values and new limits and new contradictions. And I feel really, I feel this great sense of urgency in my work and my practice and my thinking, as I'm sure we all do, about how, at least in this country, we are poised on the precipice of a new era of massive infrastructural development. And I'm not gonna go into the weeds, although I'd love to, on the sort of unjust history of redlining and urban renewal and land ownership zoning, you know, racist zoning and xenophobia and lots of other types of unjust fear that are designed into our urban landscapes. But, you know, I will say that we have a chance that is rapidly arising for a do-over. And my sense of urgency is around being able to answer this question, basically being able to answer the question of what we do with the infrastructure that we've got as we enter this new era of infrastructural development, what we can repurpose, what we can rebuild. And, you know, I think that we get to design what we build next. And I don't think we have a choice.
Go ahead, Wes.
I've been thinking for a few years now about the mass migrations that are underway and seem to be picking up here and now and then. And thinking, if you have people that are on the move, how can you have people that are stationary enough to do more than simply stay alive? And so that got me into looking into the two exiles of the Hebrews, because here was a people in the making of a people that pretty well got things nailed down for a while, except, unfortunately, Nebuchadnezzar and his bunch over some 400 miles away, they were through battling. They had all that water, and they were wanting to build canals and so on, and so they go over to those Hebrews and they take a bunch of them back. to become architects and craftsmen and this and that. They take a young king with them, but they won a battle, and they brought home experts. That was the primary feature, and they really went to work. They'd been at war for 25 years or so, and so they didn't have many people left. A lot of those folk had died. Well, then they got irritated, and so the Israelites kept asking, how did we sin against God? How did we, meaning we as a people, sin against God? And they kept asking that question. Well, Nebuchadnezzar comes back again for other reasons. This time he destroys everything. And after that, the Hebrew prophets are saying, how can we as individuals connect to God? And I think that was a fallback position. And what it tells me is the necessity of having the we and the individuals connected. In other words, there was a period back in, back in the 60s and 70s, there were plenty of folk that thought it was good enough to get a shotgun and an A-frame in Canada. And, they'd be able to take care of everything from then on. Total independence, self-reliance. Well, I think this is a problem for us. It's an opportunity, I should say, for us to confront that relationship between the individual's relationship to the earth and the group of working together somehow. And that's going to be a hard task. But the important thing is that with these migrations, there's a scramble. And we got to stay put long enough in places so that things don't get undone. So to me, that's the message, the most important message coming out of those two exiles. And I've been quite interested in that, the making of a people, and the leaving of, it was manifest destiny, and plenty of things wrong with that. But once in place, they began to dig in, but it all had to do originally with displeasing, and I would say in our time, displeasing the earth some way, and wondering where they screwed up. So versus then later the individual. Anyway, that's just a way of saying it can't be just the individual. In fact, I think my good friends that are working, local organic community supported agriculture, that it's got to go beyond that. It's a good beginning, but it's got to go beyond that, because it's just 2 or 3 notches above the shotgun and the A-frame in Canada.
Okay. Again, I'm reading a lot of questions that are very detailed, and I'm going to try a way of not only summarizing, but trying to get at some of the tension in the group. So bear with me on this one. A lot of these questions and thoughts, I think, are about where should we put our hopes for trustworthy guidance? That means not only where do we get trustworthy information in a sort of superficial sense, but how do we understand how to use that information? We've talked about the limits of the technocratic approach, yet modern science has taught us things about the world that, as Wes pointed out, were simply not known. As a system of inquiry, modern science is sort of unparalleled, yet modern science has not guaranteed the wisdom with which humans can use that knowledge. There's a lot of talk in the chat room and the Q&A about indigenous and traditional systems of knowledge. So I guess, again, I'm kind of typically going to Caitlin for the built world, and west for the application to agriculture. But how do you think about the balancing of, again, the scientific and technical knowledge, which has greatly expanded our understanding of physical processes, and the need to marry that with the wisdom to deal with these crises? I realize that's sort of vague and open-ended, but I think it would help for both of you to talk about that. Caitlin, maybe you can start.
Sure. I think I'll answer pretty briefly to say that the outcome, in my mind, of good science around, some of the, just as an example, some of the embodied carbon research we've been doing about the built world and the materials that comprise it. The good outcome of that knowledge is more information about the interconnectedness of everything, which to me is like, how I answer the question of what's sacred in my life and in my work. So maybe that's a sort of unsatisfying answer, but to me, those two things are the same, that the scientific research, the data, the trustworthy guidance that we receive, that we participate in, is teaching us about the interconnectedness of everything and teaching us about our entangled and collective future. And it reminds me of the difference, which I'm sure everyone here knows, between the term, the word complicated and the meaning of complexity, right? Complicated is like a car engine where you know how all the pieces relate to each other, and you know what happens when you push on this part and pull on that part. But complexity is more dynamic than that, right? It's more indeterminate. And I think that we can learn from the research, we can learn from the data about our interconnectedness, but that in doing so, we find the edges of what we can know. And that's the sort of boundary of indeterminacy that I think we all have to design for in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah, that idea of the boundary. Lewontin and Levins and the dialectical biologist are the ones that introduced the phrase to me about the boundary of consideration has to overlap the boundary of causation. And in this reductive world that we currently live in, the boundary is often ignored. Some little piece is pulled out of it. And this is one of my main gurus, who's dead now, is J. Stan Rowe, where he talks about the ecosystem as a conceptual rule. Actually, Arnold Schultz at Berkeley is the one that wrote the paper on that, but a lot of that came from Stan Rowe. The ecosystem as a conceptual rule for the management of our resources. Well, the value of that is, as Caitlin's pointing out, is that this is, we're talking about slabs of space-time that are wholly integrated. And it's actually a pretty good exercise when somebody says, I'm an environmentalist. And you ask, well, what do you mean by that? And says, well, I got an environment. Well, then you start asking, what is your environment? And if they are really thoughtful people, mostly sober, they will end up defining a very large dependency, including what's coming from the sun to be captured by a leaf. In other words, to see that whole. And I think one of the worst things that the scientific world has done, and on the one hand, you need it, but then I think it was Lewontin and Levinton also said, the world is not like the method. And while on the one hand, we are engaged in reductive behavior, that is a method, but the world is not like that. And it's our challenge to be clear that the world is not like the method, even as we are going after. So we've got, I think a lot about that period from 1660 to 63 is when the Royal Society was being formed. And they got the rules of conduct out of that period. The rules of how you're to do things. A lot of that goes back to Bacon in his New Atlantis, where the modern scientific laboratory is described right there. And there were a lot of scientists before that were achieving things, but the formalization of a way of thinking about the world and how to operate within it really got fixed right there in the 1660 to 1663 period. And it's unfortunate then, I don't want to say anything bad about the French, but that period of, well, never mind that. What am I trying to say? On the one hand, it is scientists that has let us know that we are products of a dying star and that we don't have the old heaven that we used to. And we don't, we now have an idea of process is God rather than some three-dimensional godhood. And that has helped us go, but then we keep falling back to this reductive approach in which we are able to exercise our cleverness and forget the larger boundary. That, to me, is the big philosophical journey that is got to be dealt with time and again. So I thank you for your causing that to come out of me.
I think we only have time for probably one more question. And again, I'm trying to synthesize here. So we've been talking about, not only today, but yesterday, about the biophysical limits of the planet. But underneath a lot of the conversation today also is about the recognition there are limits to the human being. There is something to this notion of human nature. Unless you're a Skinnerian behaviorist, we are not blank slates. We have a genetic predisposition. There are things we do and don't do. And just like we're dealing with a degraded landscape and degraded ecosystems, you could say in some sense we're dealing with a degraded human nature that's been so distorted by advertising and ideologies of various kinds. There were several questions, again, about the practicality. We need to get off fossil fuels. There's talk about a cap, but is that feasible? Are there intermediate steps? We need to stop using fossil fuels to thwart climate change, but are there intermediate steps? So maybe just in conclusion, real quickly, again, both of you could talk about how the reality of the world we live in, both the landscapes and the current state of humanity, where do they lead you in your work? What do you hope to work on in the coming years that takes all this seriously?
Your company, Caitlin.
Okay. I think that to answer that question, I will return to my early attempts at redefining the word infrastructure. I think that that's what I hope to work on in in the future going forward from here. You know, we have, as I mentioned in my introductory talk, we've used the word infrastructure in very sloppy ways to define sort of artificial boundaries, to go back to that idea of boundary, to try, impossibly try to draw hard lines between the, us and the rest of the world, the hard stuff and the soft stuff. And we've used infrastructure as a tool for organizing the world, for fighting entropy, for maximizing efficiency. And my work has been and will continue to be an attempt at redefining infrastructure to instead be designed as a minimum scaffolding. Like, what is the smallest thing? And I'm using the words small both in terms of physical size, but also in terms of sort of impact, that can deeply root itself, and then allow, the analogy that I think of sometimes is like coral reef seeding, the like wire mesh that is put down in the water so that the coral can regrow on it. Like, what is an infrastructure that is deeply rooted in its place and can, in the same way, secure the roots of regional economies and ecologies? How can we take the infrastructure that we have today and radically rethink what's possible with it, make it smaller, make it less impactful, reuse it in imaginative ways in order to host regional economies and communities? So I think that's how I would answer that question.
Yeah. I think I'm answering the question, but I'm going to answer it in my own way. Leopold Kohr was an inspiration to E.F. Schumacher, who wrote the book Economics as If People Mattered. Leopold Kohr, and Schumacher, was an economist. And Leopold Kohr was interested in economics, but he paid no attention to almost any economic theory that was around. He lived in a rather small village in Switzerland. And he says, if your scale is right, you will get your economy right. I'm thinking of something I read many years ago, and I pulled it out again. It was a piece by Louis Bromfeld. Louis Bromfeld was one of those novelists that lived along the left bank of the Seine at the time of Gertrude Stein and Hemingway and all that bunch from 1920s, 1930s. And he lived 30 miles north of Paris, and there was like 30 acres there that was owned by 3 sisters. And he tried to buy that acreage, and it was able to he was offering twice the value of that acreage. He thought it was a beautiful place, and he was the farmer that started Malabar Farm. But here he was, a novelist, an essayist, a movie person, and so on. And he wanted that place because he loved to garden and prepare food and so on. They wouldn't sell. And the oldest sister said, I could sell that to you, and you could pay me 10 times. But that sister was also alive in 1870 when the Germanic people and the French had a tuggle. And she had lived during that period and also during World War I. And she said, at 10 times, I would have the money, and she knew that she could lose it. Well, he went on to say, Bromfield went on to say, 1941, and she was right, that if she had given me, if I'd given her 10 times the money, she would be penniless today. And that's a way of emphasizing that your real economy rests in land. We are land animals. And to get that straight and not think, well, we're going to get a whole bunch of money and then I'll just sit somewhere. No. That is a cultural wrongheadedness, given that we are in this apocalypse that we've been in for 10,000 years, and that we're blinded during this industrial revolution period. So there you are. I don't know if I answered the question, but I don't care.
All right. Folks, I know we're over time, but I do want to try and wrap things up. First of all, a reminder to everyone that there's a final session this afternoon, 2 p.m. Central Time, Community Courage, which I think is going to help a lot of us struggle with the emotions that come up when we talk about this. I was thinking of the phrase people have used in recent years, the United States of amnesia. The idea that we're trying to understand this and grapple with it and dealing with a culture that is prone to forgetting. I thought of that because in the chat bar, Peter had a great phrase, convenience creates amnesia. That we're dealing with a culture that doesn't want to remember its real history. And we're all tempted by that convenience ourselves. This isn't about preaching on high about everybody else's failures, that we're all struggling with this. And I think that's important to keep in mind. I'm going to take the facilitator prerogative to suggest we end by going back to that poem that Caitlin referenced in her final slide, Wendell Berry's How to Be a Poet. And I think it's a good transition to this afternoon, where we're going to try and deal with some of the feeling. So I'm not much on recitation, but I'm going to end by simply reading the complete Wendell poem as a segue to this afternoon, and to maybe put us in a space where we're trying to deal with our own emotional lives. So this is How to Be a Poet by Wendell Berry. I used to introduce it to classes by saying it easily also could be called How to Be a Human Being. And here's what Wendell says. Make a place to sit down, be quiet. You must depend on affection, reading, knowledge, skill, more of each than you have, inspiration, work, growing older, patience, for patience joins time to eternity. Any readers who like your poems, doubt their judgment. Breathe with unconditioned breath the unconditioned air. Shun electric wire, communicate slowly, live a three-dimensioned life. Stay away from screens, stay away from anything that obscures the place it is in. There are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. Accept what comes from silence. Make the best you can of it. Of the little words that come out of the silence, like prayers prayed back to the one who prays, make a poem that does not disturb the silence from which it came. So with that, thanks to everybody. Thanks especially to Caitlin and Wes. Thanks to all the people who asked questions and made comments, which I did not do justice to. I'm well aware of that, and I apologize. But I'm again want to say thanks to Aubrey, Will, Megan, Carl, the staff that have been making all of this work, and really looking forward to seeing everybody again at 2 p.m. Central. Aubrey, any concluding instructions?
Please join us this afternoon. Just a lot of gratitude to everyone, and the conversation will continue.
Thanks everybody so much for having me. It's been really a pleasure. I'm so looking forward to more of these conversations.
See you this afternoon.